They sent me a wedding invitation without my name on it. At the reception, I sat next to the kitchen while my son raised a toast with his new wife's family. Not a single glance, not a single word. I felt like I had been erased. But when they handed me the $65,000 invoice, I finally understood. What came next? They never saw it coming. The envelope was thick and cream-colored. It had that heavy, formal feel of something important. No return address. Just my name, handwritten, and Boise, Idaho. I knew right away it was from Mason. I took it to the kitchen table, slid my finger under the flap, and pulled out the invitation. Gold trim, pressed lettering, elegant design. But no message, not a word. Just the date, time, and place of his wedding. There was no, "Mum, I'd love to see you there." No call, no email, no one asked if I needed help getting to Seattle. It felt more like a formality than a welcome. Still, I pressed my dress shirt and picked out the lavender skirt suit I hadn't worn since my retirement gala. I remembered Mason used to say, "Purple made me look like royalty." That was a long time ago. I bought a wedding gift too, a vintage leather suitcase, the same brand his father used when we were young. Inside, I tucked a handwritten letter and a family photo, Mason at age 9 with chocolate on his chin, laughing. That version of him still lived somewhere in my memory. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I figured if they didn't want me there, they'd make it clear enough. I booked a room near Lake Union and flew out 2 days early. The morning of the wedding, I sat by the hotel window, watching the mist roll off the water. Something in my chest felt tight, like I was bracing for impact. At the venue, no one recognized me at first. The coordinator scanned the guest list. She squinted, looked back at me, and then pointed to a small table near the kitchen doors. No nameplate, no flowers, just a chair. Close enough to hear the clatter of dishes, far enough not to be seen in photos. I sat down quietly. From there I could see Aspen greeting her family, air-kissing aunts and uncles, flashing smiles. Mason looked sharp in his suit, arm around her waist, laughing like life had always been this perfect. No one looked my way. No one asked where I'd been. I rested my hands on my lap and tried to keep them from shaking. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. It's funny how silence can speak louder than any insult. Let me ask you, have you ever shown up for someone, only to realize you were never really invited in the first place? That day, I sat in the corner and watched my son marry a woman who didn't know my name, and maybe worse, didn't want to. But I stayed, at least for a while. And what happened next? Well, let's just say they left me no choice. The music swelled, soft jazz underlining the clinking of glasses and laughter that floated across the hall. I stayed in that corner seat, near the kitchen. The tablecloth was a size too small, and one of the legs of the chair wobbled every time I shifted. From where I sat, I had a view of the entire room, but it felt like I wasn't part of it at all. No one made eye contact, no one approached. I watched as Aspen's side of the family moved in a carefully choreographed swirl, one group hugging another, wine flowing into crystal glasses, cameras flashing. Someone brought out a dessert tray, and a small child walked by holding a cupcake twice the size of her hand. Mason stood by the fireplace in the grand ballroom, laughing at something a man whispered in his ear. He hadn't looked my way once. My son, in a slate blue suit I didn't recognize, belonged to a world that had no place for the woman who had ironed his church shirts and packed his lunch for 12 years straight. Just then, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Aspen walked past my table, her arm hooked through a friend's. Her dress shimmered with beads and subtle embroidery, elegant and precise, like everything else she'd curated for that day. As she passed, she glanced sideways. Her eyes landed on me, then flicked back forward. She paused for a breath, then said, flat and quick, not breaking stride, "Oh, you're here." That was all. No smile, no welcome, not a second glance. I sat there, stunned, but expressionless. I had practiced for this possibility in my mind, but reality landed harder than any scenario I had imagined. I reached for the water glass, found it half empty, and noticed there was no bread basket on my table like the others. No name card either. The servers avoided my section entirely. The microphone screeched slightly as the best man gave a toast. More laughter, more clapping. I let my gaze fall to the floor, the dark wood polished to a shine. My shoes, simple black flats, looked suddenly out of place next to the glittering heels and patent leather that moved past me without pause. Near the end of the evening, the event manager approached with a neutral smile. She leaned in slightly and placed a sealed white envelope next to my half-eaten salad. Her badge said Rachel. She said my name softly, then added, "This is for you." Inside the envelope was a typed document, an invoice, a bill for $65,000. At the top, wedding reception balance, due upon delivery. And at the bottom, underlined, was my name. No note, no explanation, just a number. I sat very still. The paper shook slightly in my hands, so I folded it once and slid it into my purse. I stood, took one last look at the room I was never truly part of, and walked out quietly through the side entrance. No one followed. Outside, the sky had gone soft and grey. The city lights shimmered on Lake Union. I waited for a cab under a canopy of silence. That night, back in my hotel room, I kept the lights on. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just sat in the quiet, letting the cold draft from the window press against my skin like a truth I could no longer ignore. The morning light didn't bring much comfort. I sat at the edge of the bed, still in yesterday's clothes, the envelope now tucked into the drawer beside the lamp. I hadn't opened the curtains, I hadn't turned off the light. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was thick, like a coat I couldn't shrug off. Around 9, the hotel phone rang. I let it buzz until it stopped. 10 minutes later, it rang again. I answered without thinking. A familiar voice on the other end, one I had soothed through fevers and heartbreaks, said softly, "Mum, it's me." Mason, as if I wouldn't recognize his voice. He spoke slowly, as if picking his way through a minefield. He said the event had gotten overwhelming, that Aspen's parents had been pushing for a certain guest list, that there were costs they didn't expect. I stayed silent. Then came the real reason for the call, the invoice. He mentioned it like it had been casually brought up, like someone had slipped it into the wrong envelope by accident. His voice shifted, trying to sound light. He said, "Mum, it's just this one time. We had some unexpected overages. Aspen's dad said he wasn't covering anything beyond the original budget. We were already stretched. I thought maybe you could help. You know, just this once." I didn't interrupt. I wanted to see how far he would go. He added, "You're the only one I could ask. You've always been there." The silence on my end lingered longer than I intended. Then, in the background, I heard Aspen's voice. She wasn't whispering. She wasn't trying to hide what she said. "That's exactly why I didn't put her name on the table chart. She always makes things about her." My hand gripped the edge of the nightstand. I felt something tighten behind my eyes, but I didn't let it surface. Mason didn't defend me. He didn't ask her to stop. He just waited. I finally spoke. I said, "I see." Then I ended the call. There was nothing else to say. By noon, I checked out of the hotel. I didn't call a cab. I walked to the station with my small suitcase rolling behind me. The air was crisp, but not cold. The city felt unfamiliar in a way that made it easier to leave. Back home in Boise, I unpacked slowly. Everything smelled faintly of the lavender sachets I had placed in the folds of the dress I never really wore. That night, I poured myself a glass of water and took the wedding gift out from the closet. A vintage leather suitcase. The same brand Mason used to admire when he was younger. I had tracked it down through a collector and had it polished, restored, and monogrammed with his initials. Inside, I had planned to leave a handwritten letter. I opened the small envelope tucked in the side compartment. My handwriting looked delicate and too hopeful now. It read, "To my son, for your new journey, may you carry only what truly matters." I held it for a while, then folded it back in, not sealing it. 2 days later, the suitcase was returned. The shipping label was crossed out. A bright orange sticker said, "Return to sender. Recipient declined." No explanation. I opened it one last time, took out the note, added a line at the bottom, "This is no longer yours to carry." Then I tucked the letter into the back of my drawer, beneath old photographs and birth announcements. I didn't cry, but I didn't sleep that night either. The call came later that night. I had just taken off my earrings and was folding the shawl I wore to the reception when Mason's name lit up my phone. For a moment I stared at the screen, unsure if I wanted to answer. But I did. His voice was softer than usual, almost rehearsed. He said the costs for the wedding had gone up. Aspen's family had only covered a portion of what they promised, and there were venue overages, last-minute additions, floral charges, the band, upgraded dinner menu. He listed each item like he had memorized it. Then came the real reason. He said the event planner had mistakenly put the invoice under my name because he had used my address during a booking error. But it would be easy if I just covered it now. Only $65,000. Just this once. For him. For his future. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence sit between us. He added that I had always been there for him, that I was the reason he made it through college, that without me, he wouldn't be where he was. And then, almost as an afterthought, he said Aspen didn't want to bother her parents. She felt it was too much to ask from her side. Too much. Yet not too much to send a bill to a 71-year-old woman who hadn't even been offered a seat in the reception hall. I sat there on the edge of the bed, holding the phone to my ear, listening to my son plead like a stranger. His words sounded rehearsed, but there was something else. Shame. Maybe not for what he had done, but shame that he had to ask. When I said I couldn't do it, my voice didn't shake. I simply said, "No." There was a pause, a long, stretched kind of silence. Then he asked if I was okay, if I needed more time to think. I said I didn't. I wished him well. I told him the reception was beautiful. And then I hung up. No tears. Just a quiet kind of disbelief. I had sold my laundry business a few years ago. Not because I needed to. I had done it so I could simplify, maybe travel, maybe help Mason with his startup. I had planned to gift him a portion of it after the wedding. But all of that felt like a different lifetime now. The next morning, I walked out of the hotel early. The streets around Lake Union were quiet, still damp from the night's rain. I sat by the water for a while. The clouds hung low, and boats sat still in the marina, as if waiting for a wind that wouldn't come. Something in me began to still too. A part of me had waited for Mason to see me that night. Really see me. Not as a name on a checkbook, not as the woman behind his tuition or his first apartment, but as his mother. That clarity came like a slow tide. No drama, No anger, just quiet truth. Back in my room, I packed slowly. I placed the lavender gift box back in my suitcase. I had picked it for Aspen myself. Inside was a vintage leather suitcase, the same brand my mother had once gifted me when I got married. The note I had written sat beneath it, folded. I didn't take the note out. Not yet. Instead, I zipped up the suitcase, picked up the bill for $65,000 and slid it into my wallet without folding it. Not because I planned to pay it, but because I wanted to carry it home with me, not as a burden, but as proof that I saw everything clearly now. I left the hotel before sunrise. There was no note, no goodbye. Just the quiet click of the door behind me as I walked out with my suitcase and the gift box still sealed. My heels echoed softly through the hallway. At the front desk, I nodded politely, handed over the key, and stepped into the morning mist of Seattle. The streets were mostly empty. The city hadn't woken up yet, just the occasional jogger and the buzz of an early delivery truck. I walked with no real destination in mind. The quiet helped. I found a bench by Lake Union and sat down, watching the light stretch over the still water. My hands rested on my lap. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry. I just felt clean, like a wound had stopped bleeding. By the time I returned to my apartment in Boise, it was early afternoon. I set down the suitcase by the front door and went into the kitchen. Everything smelled like home, the same way it had for the last 16 years since my husband passed. I had made peace with solitude a long time ago, but that afternoon it felt less like loneliness and more like safety. I changed into comfortable clothes, made a cup of tea, and sat by the window. The wedding gift still sat in the suitcase. I didn't touch it. I wasn't ready. Instead, I opened my wallet and pulled out the folded invoice. I smoothed it out on the table. $65,000. For a wedding I wasn't invited to. For a seat next to a kitchen door. For a name that was never printed. I didn't rip it. I didn't burn it. I just looked at it. For a long time. The next morning I logged into my old email. I searched for the contact information of the law firm I had worked with when preparing my will years ago. My fingers didn't shake as I typed. I left a message asking if Mr. Coughlin was still at the firm. I wanted to discuss a trust account. After sending the message, I closed the laptop and sat back. For the first time since the wedding, I took a deep breath. It filled my chest and emptied slowly, like something heavy had finally shifted. The house was quiet, but not in a painful way. I moved from room to room, touching objects I had once planned to pass on to Mason. A lamp my husband had rewired with his own hands. The quilt we both liked to fold at the end of the bed. Photographs in frames that used to mean future memories. I walked through each room, slowly taking mental inventory. Not of things I needed to let go of, but of what I needed to reclaim. That evening, I opened my phone and scrolled through Mason's wedding photos. Not a single one showed me. Not a corner of my dress. Not a single mention in Aspen's glowing captions. Just bright faces, expensive smiles, curated happiness. As if I hadn't been there at all. There was a line in one of Aspen's posts. She wrote, "All the people who truly love and support us were present tonight." My chest went cold, and then still. I took one last look and turned off the phone, set it face down. I opened the closet and pulled out an old box. Inside were photographs, drawings Mason made when he was 6, birthday cards, airline tickets from his first trip to Europe. I didn't throw them away, but I did something I never thought I would. I labeled the box. Then I slid it to the far back of the shelf. I wasn't erasing the past. I was simply no longer offering it as a gift. That Monday morning, I woke up with a dull ache in my chest. It wasn't pain exactly, more like an empty space that used to be filled with something warmer. I made coffee, took my pills, then sat at the kitchen table with my tablet. The first thing I saw when I opened Mason's profile was the photo of them under the arbor. Aspen's caption read, "A night we'll never forget, surrounded by love, surrounded by those who matter." I stared at it a long time. I tried to focus on the tablecloth behind them, thinking maybe I could find the corner of my chair, some blurry detail that proved I'd been there. But no, it was as if I had been scrubbed out entirely. I scrolled down. Another post. This one had a carousel of photos. Aspen twirling with her bridesmaids, Mason laughing with her brother, a toast, dancing, cake cutting, all the rituals. None of them had me. Then came a video. Someone had recorded a short speech Aspen gave during the dinner. She smiled into the microphone and said, "We're so grateful to have each and every one of you here tonight. It means everything to start our marriage with the support of the people who truly love and believe in us." The crowd clapped. I sat frozen. I closed the app. My hands stayed on the screen for a while before I gently set it aside. Then I got up, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled down the cardboard box labeled Mason, the same box I had pushed to the back the other night. I opened it again. There were letters, photos, his high school diploma, a postcard he sent me from Alaska when he worked summer shifts on fishing boats. I traced my fingers over the handwriting. I looked at his smile, younger and brighter than the man I'd just watched get married without ever once saying my name. One by one, I took things out and began sorting, not by date, but by memory. What still warmed me, what now stung. The last thing in the box was a printed copy of the letter I had once written him on his 30th birthday. I had poured my heart into that one. It spoke of dreams, of pride, of the man I hoped he would become. I read the final lines, my own handwriting trembling from years ago. "You will always have a place to return to. I am your home, no matter where life takes you." I folded it back, slipped it into a new envelope, and sealed it again. But I didn't put it back in the box. I placed it in my desk drawer, quietly, like setting down something sacred for the last time. The next day, I went through my emails, found the shared drive folder where I had once uploaded every childhood photo for Mason's college slideshow. I clicked Remove Access. Then I found an old flash drive labeled Family Recipes. I copied all the files to a new folder, then deleted the old one from the cloud. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't bitterness. It was an ending. And in some small way, a beginning. Because sometimes, what people erase from their version of events doesn't have to define you. Sometimes, choosing to be invisible to others is the only way to finally see yourself again. I called Thomas the next morning. He was my estate attorney from nearly 10 years ago when I first opened the Living Trust. Back then, it felt premature. Mason had just graduated with his MBA, and Aspen was still in her last year of law school. I believed in planning ahead. That was always my way. When Thomas picked up, I told him I needed to revisit the trust paperwork. He said he could fit me in that afternoon. I didn't hesitate. His office hadn't changed. Same walnut bookshelves, same framed photos of the Tetons. He greeted me kindly, offered tea. I declined. I got straight to it. I told him I wanted to formally halt the transfer of funds to Mason. The original plan had been to move my entire retirement account into a trust solely under his name before my 75th birthday. We'd prepared the documents years ago. I just never signed. Back then, I hesitated because Aspen had started doing little things. Polite on the surface, but always steering conversations, always hinting I was old-fashioned or unnecessary. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was just adjusting to not being needed so much anymore. So I left the trust unsigned. It sat in a folder in my drawer. Thomas raised his eyebrows slightly but said nothing, just pulled up the digital files. We walked through the clauses again. I had named Mason as the sole beneficiary. He would inherit the bulk of my liquid savings, my long-term investments, and a partial interest in a small property I had in Idaho Falls. I asked Thomas to void the documents. He paused before speaking, said that, given no formal execution had taken place, he could simply archive them, lock the file, and make a note that no action should proceed without my direct consent in writing. That sounded good to me. Then I took a breath and told him I also wanted to create a new document. Not a trust. Not yet. Just a private record of intention. I wanted to redirect any future transfers toward an educational foundation, something that would support women over 60 who wanted to return to school or retrain for a new profession. Thomas looked at me, and for the first time in our meeting, I saw something shift in his face. He nodded, then opened a new document window. He asked for a name. I told him I hadn't chosen one yet, but I would. When we finished, he printed out the one-page record. I signed it. He slid it into a new file with my initials on the tab. As I walked back to the car, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel bitter either. Just clear, like something had lifted. At home, I opened the drawer where the unsigned trust had lived for years. I pulled it out one last time. The pages were still crisp. I folded them twice and placed them in the shredder. Then I went to the shelf where I kept old photo albums. I pulled out one with a green spine labeled Family 2000-2010. I took a sticky note and wrote one word. Pause. I stuck it on the front and returned it to the shelf. That night, I slept without waking once. No dreams, no restlessness, just a deep, still silence. And in that silence, I didn't miss anyone, not even Mason. Not because I had stopped loving him, but because I had started choosing myself. A week after the wedding, a knock came at my door just before noon. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened it, there was no one there. Just a small rectangular box sitting neatly on the doormat. The return label said nothing but the name of a courier service. I brought it inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened it carefully. Inside was the wedding gift I had sent to Mason and Aspen. It was a vintage leather suitcase, worn just enough to feel lived in, but still handsome and polished. I had found it years ago in a shop in Madrid, thinking it would someday be perfect for Mason. A traveler's gift, something symbolic, something with meaning. But now it sat back in my hands, unopened. On top was a folded note. I opened it. One sentence. Handwritten in tight, sharp penmanship. Recipient declined delivery. No salutation. No signature. Not even a scribble of thanks or explanation. Just cold, impersonal rejection. I sat still for a long time. Then I opened the suitcase. Tucked into its inner pocket was the letter I had written weeks ago, meant to go with the gift. The ink had slightly smudged in places, probably from the humidity during shipping. I read it again. It was a soft letter, just a few paragraphs. I had written about memories, about the trips Mason and I took when he was little. How he used to sit on the luggage belt at the airport until I scooped him off and handed him a juice box. How he had always said he wanted to see the world. I had told him I hoped this suitcase would be with him on the journeys he and Aspen would make together. That I believed in love built over time, not purchased with decoration. I set the letter down, took a breath. then reached for a pen. I added one line at the bottom. This gift no longer belongs to anyone. Then I folded it neatly, put it back in the suitcase, and closed the latch. The suitcase went back into my closet, high up, near the winter coats and spare blankets. Somewhere it wouldn't stare at me every day, but somewhere I could still reach if I needed to. The weight of it was heavier than I remembered, not because of its size, but because of what had been taken out of it. Intention, memory, hope. I didn't cry. I didn't curse them. I didn't even speak. Later that evening, I sat by the window with a cup of tea. I watched the light fade along the street, watched the neighbour's dog wander from lawn to lawn, sniffing flowers and mailboxes. I thought about how animals always seem to know their place in the world, not in a grand way, just in a simple, matter-of-fact way. I envied that. The house was quiet, not a lonely quiet, more like the quiet that comes after you finally close a book that took you too long to finish. You're not sad it ended. You're just surprised you stayed with it for so long. That night, I went to bed with the window cracked open and no alarms set. And for the first time since the wedding, I didn't check my phone once before sleep. The call came in just past 8 on a Thursday morning. I had left my phone on the counter while watering the potted mint by the window. When I picked it up, Mason's name was on the screen, the same name I had stared at many times without touching. But this time, my thumb moved. I answered. His voice came through slowly, almost uncertain. He asked how I was doing. I said I was fine. There was a pause. Then he said, Aspen had told him about the suitcase, said she hadn't expected me to send something, so… He trailed off. He was careful with his words. Polite, but not warm, like someone walking across a cracked sidewalk, unsure which part would give way. Then he said he had meant to call earlier, that he knew the seating at the wedding hadn't been ideal, that maybe the table by the kitchen had been a mistake. I let the silence stretch just long enough to let that land. Then I asked, in the calmest voice I could manage, if he had anything to say about the envelope I received at the reception. He stammered, said something about how the planners must have assumed I was paying for part of it, that Aspen had been overwhelmed, that he didn't think it was fair to put all the pressure on her. Then he said a sentence I didn't expect. Maybe you just misunderstood. I stood still in the middle of the kitchen, my hands cold despite the morning sun coming through the blinds. I told him I hadn't misunderstood anything. I told him that Aspen had looked me in the eyes and said I didn't belong in their family, that she had chosen not to put my name on the seating chart, that she had returned the gift without even a thank you, that the caption she wrote online made it clear who counted and who didn't. Then I asked him something I had never asked before. When she said those things, what did you do? He didn't answer. I heard his breath shift on the other end of the line. I imagined him sitting at the kitchen island, rubbing the back of his neck the way he used to when he was caught in a lie as a boy. But now, he was not a boy. He was a man with a wife who had drawn a line, and he had chosen which side of the line to stand on. After a long silence, he said he didn't want things to be like this, that he still wanted me to be part of their lives, that they were talking about starting a family. I closed my eyes. Then I told him something I had not planned to say out loud. Families are not built on blood. They are built on courage. And when someone watches another be humiliated and says nothing, they are not standing with love. They are standing with fear. I said I hoped he would find his courage someday, and I ended the call. The screen dimmed. The room fell quiet. I looked around the kitchen. The teapot was still warm. The mint leaves outside were catching the light. Everything was ordinary, except it wasn't. Something had closed in that call, not with anger, not with finality, but with truth. And truth has a sound. It is not loud. It is not cruel. It is just clear. 2 weeks after that phone call, an envelope arrived at Mason's house. It was not handwritten. It came straight from the bank, marked confidential, with a red stripe across the seal. Aspen signed for it, thinking it might be a formality left over from the wedding payments. Inside was a notice of temporary asset hold. Not just his name, his and mine. 3 properties, 2 accounts, and a joint tax document were now flagged for review. Nothing illegal, nothing accusatory. Just a polite but firm letter stating that the institutions had been notified of a reassessment due to recent changes in the beneficiary structure. He called that same night. His voice sounded sharper this time. Less guilt, more confusion. But I let him speak. He said he had just opened the envelope. Said he didn't understand why the accounts had been touched. Why things that had always been assumed to be his someday were now under scrutiny. He said he thought we were still working toward the same trust, that what I had done felt sudden, out of step. I didn't interrupt. I waited. When he finished, I told him I had once believed that love meant preparing everything for those you care about, even when they don't see it. But now I believed love required clarity. I reminded him about the $820,000 I had once marked for transfer, about the years I spent building that amount, working overtime, budgeting, skipping vacations, about the times he had said he didn't want anything from me but support, and how I had believed him. Then I said the simplest truth. That support does not mean silence, that legacy does not mean blind giving, and that being a mother does not mean letting others decide the terms of my dignity. He didn't speak for a while. Then he asked if this was about Aspen. I said this was about boundaries, about recognizing when someone is not a child anymore and has chosen their path, about acknowledging when that path no longer includes respect. I told him the hold was not permanent. It was a pause, a chance to look again at what we were really building, and who was part of it. He didn't reply. So I told him one more thing. I told him I had updated my directives, that he would no longer be listed as the primary successor on any document until further review, not out of spite, but out of alignment. That word seemed to stay with him. Alignment. I could almost hear him turning it over in his mind. Not anger, not sadness, just realization. We ended the call without goodbyes. The next morning I made oatmeal with chopped pears and almond slivers. I ate in silence, looking out at the maple trees just beginning to show yellow. Outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. There was no rage, no revenge, just stillness and a rebalancing. Some things we inherit by blood. Others we earn by how we show up when it matters. And sometimes it takes a signed letter and a frozen line on a spreadsheet to remind both sides where the real values lie. The invitation came in an email. Subject line, Alumni Series Speaker Request, Retired Crew Voices. I stared at it longer than I needed to. A familiar name from a training program years ago had passed along my contact to the committee. They wanted a retired crew member with decades of experience, someone who had witnessed the shifts in the industry from manual logs to digital checklists, from midnight flights to corporate takeovers. I said yes. The event was held at a small auditorium near SeaTac, hosted by a union of retired flight professionals. No lights, no fanfare, just chairs arranged in rows and a modest podium with a bottle of water. And about 60 people, mostly silver-haired, mostly quiet. I didn't plan what I was going to say. I brought no speech. I carried only one item in my bag, the wedding invitation. When it was my turn, I walked up slowly, I rested my hand on the podium and just let the room breathe with me. I spoke about loyalty, about long hours, missed birthdays, rerouted holidays. I spoke about crewmates I had lost and passengers who had once changed my life with a simple thank you. Then I told them about something recent, about how I received an invitation to my own son's wedding. Blank. No name, no message. About how I showed up anyway, bought a gift, dressed in lavender, and found myself seated by the kitchen. About how no one said welcome. About how I was handed a bill instead of a thank you. I didn't name names. I didn't speak in anger. I just let the silence linger after each sentence. Then I said one thing that made a few heads lift. I said, I used to believe that giving birth to someone meant you would always have a place in their life. That biology secured belonging, but I had learned that relationships have to be tended, that presence cannot be demanded, that respect, once lost, leaves no receipts to show. One woman near the back nodded. Another took off her glasses and wiped her eyes. It wasn't sympathy I wanted. It was acknowledgement. I ended with a line that had come to me one morning while folding a letter I never sent. I said, I have flown through turbulence sharp enough to shake trays loose and knock my knees black and blue, but nothing rocked me more than watching the child I raised pretend I was invisible. And I survived that too. When I stepped down, no one clapped right away. It wasn't that kind of crowd, but they stood, one by one, a quiet standing, and in that silence I felt something return. Not from Mason, not from Aspen, from myself. It wasn't pride, not even peace. It was a quiet reclamation of voice, of space, of the truth that when you are no longer welcome in the place you helped build, it is not you who has vanished. It is the blueprint that was never drawn with you in mind. 3 months later, the phone rang on a Sunday morning. I was making oatmeal. It was raining, steady and soft against the windows. The number showed up as Mason's. I didn't pick up. A minute later, the voicemail icon blinked. I let it sit there until the pot had cooled. When I finally pressed play, it was Aspen's voice. Flat, composed. She said they were expecting a baby. She said Mason would like me to be part of the baby's life, that maybe it was time to move past everything. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask how I had been. Just a statement, a polite request for proximity. I stood there, still holding the spoon, and I knew in that moment the decision had already been made a long time ago. I didn't call back. I wrote a letter instead. Short, clear. I said I was happy for them, that becoming parents was a beautiful and humbling chapter, that I wished them health and grace in the months ahead. And then I added one sentence. I said, once, I was not considered family enough to be named on a table chart, and I have learned to live with that. I mailed the letter, nothing more. That afternoon, I opened the old leather suitcase sitting at the bottom of my closet. Inside were two things, the unsent wedding gift and a folder labeled Foundation Draft. I had been working on it quietly since that night by the lake. It was real now. Registered, notarized, waiting to be announced. A scholarship fund for women over 60 returning to school. Funded with what used to be Mason's trust. Rewritten, reassigned. The name of the foundation was stitched in gold on the folder's cover. The Letty Quinn Fund. For the women who were never seated at the table but built it anyway. I closed the suitcase and slid it back into place. And I didn't feel alone. I felt chosen by myself. If you've ever stood quietly in the corner of a room where you once belonged, I hope Letty's story speaks to you. Sometimes we wait for others to name our worth, to pull out a chair for us. But maybe it's time we build our own tables. What part of her story stayed with you the most? Let me know. Your voice matters here.